Hello, my name is Marta Carneilli and I work for TÜV as IVD Technical Officer. In the next few slides, I'm going to present the main point of European regulation for in vitro diagnostic medical devices. First, I'm going to give a brief overview of the current regulatory framework. The current regulatory framework is constituted by Directive 98/79 EC. Because this is a directive, it needs to be transposed into national legislation. That means it can result in some discrepancies or differences in interpretation between countries. The principle of this directive are that all devices to be marketed in Europe must have passed a conformity assessment fulfilling the essential requirements for performance and for safety that are described in the directive. Depending on the risk of the device, the manufacturer can complete this conformity assessment and have a self-declaration, or for higher risk devices, a third party, a notified body, needs to be involved and provide approval. The compliance with the essential requirements must be documented by the manufacturer in the device technical documentation. If the device complies with the directive requirements, this compliance is indicated by the CE mark on the device. Now, as the reference says, the directive was published in 1998 and became mandatory in December 2003. So, around the 2010, this directive was already planned for review. In addition, there were scandals linked mainly to medical devices, but that accelerated the review and resulted in 2012 in the first proposal for the new IVDR made by the Commission. To this followed discussions between all the different stakeholders involved and the publication in 2017 of the IVDR. Two corrigenda were published in 2019 to resolve some inconsistencies and clarify a few points. And the end of the transition period is May 2022. Now, the transition period, as originally planned, as I said, involved a date of application of IVDR as of 26th of May 2022, which means from the date the IVDR entered into force till May 2022, the devices can be placed on the market under the directive or the regulation. After the date of application, placing on the market occurs under the regulation, or under certain conditions, it can still happen under the IVDD. This longer transition time compared to medical devices, for example, was required because there is a entirely new regulatory structure that needs to be implemented for IVDs, the expert panel, the reference labs for high-risk devices, and also all notified bodies had to apply and be redesignated under the regulation. At the time I'm recording this presentation, a proposal has been made by the European Commission to make some changes to the transition period. That is, the IVDR date of application would remain as of 26th of May 2022 for self-declared, manufacturer self-declared devices and for new devices, that is IVD that have not been placed on the market prior to the date of application. But the Commission proposed amendments to the transitional condition for all devices that were already on the market, and also an extension of the validity of IVD D certificate of 1 year. So at the time I'm recording this is still a proposal, not yet fully approved, but we will certainly by December we will know more. Now, looking at the changes brought by the regulation, some elements are entirely new, and some were already present in the directive but have been reinforced in the regulation. So, for example, the requirement to comply with safety and performance requirements, we saw it was already present in the directive, but is reinforced with the regulation. There is, for example, an increased accent on post-market and continuous monitoring of the performance of the device and of the risk associated with this device throughout the device life cycle. This translates in a stronger post-market oversight, but also in stricter rules for technical documentation and clinical evidence. Another element that has been reinforced is the involvement of notified body, which is expanded to include roughly 80% of the device on the market. Also made stricter are requirements for economic operators. The directive really focuses on the responsibility of the manufacturer. This is maintained in the regulation with really detailed description of what the requirements are, but for manufacturers, but there are also new economic operators, such as the distributor, that are not named in the directive. They are, of course, they already exist, but their responsibilities are not defined in the regulation. But they are not defined in the directive, but they are defined in the regulation. Product scope of the regulation is also expanded to include, for example, devices that are manufactured and used within health institutions, which are totally excluded from the directive. New elements are the implementation of a unique device identification system to ensure better traceability of the devices, and a new classification of IVDs based on classification rules and not on a list of the markers, as it is the case of the directive. I'll say a few more words on that in a few minutes. The structure of the IVDR, it includes 10 chapters with 15 annexes. Each chapter, what you can see here is the title. So, for example, scope and definition are defined in chapter 1. Chapter 7 is dedicated to all post-market oversight. Chapter 10 includes the final provision, including the transitional measures. Now, I'd like to say a few more words on some key elements of the regulation. First, the classification. As I mentioned, this is totally different compared to the approach that was taken in the directive. The classification is now based on rules, a set of rules. And the IVDs are divided in 4 classes based on the risk. 2 elements of risk are taken into account: the risk for the actual individual and the risk for the public. In the lowest risk class, this would be class A, the risk for both individual and public are low. As we go from A to B and C, this both risk increase. For example, for class C, the risk for the individual will be high, but the risk to the public is still moderate. For class D, both elements of risk are high. Here we find, for example, the devices used for blood transfusion. This rule-based classification system is new for the European Union, but is not new per se, as it was described by the Global Harmonization Task Force back in 2008. And actually, the International Medical Device Regulator Forum revised this document earlier this year, but maintaining the philosophy of classification based on risk, taking into account several rules. These rules are described in Annex 8 of the regulation. The Commission late last year issued an MDCG guidance providing additional details and examples on how manufacturers should apply these rules. What you have here is examples of device type and rules that can be applied based on the device intended purpose. So the manufacturer should define the intended purpose and then assess all rules and determine which one applies best to their devices. So for example, in cancer testing devices would be class C according to rule 3. Transmissible agents that are for high risk would end up in class D. The advantage of this system compared to the system used in the directive is that it is more complex, but it provides more flexibility when new devices or new markers become available and need to be placed on the market with an appropriate conformity. Conformity assessment routes under the IVDR depends on the risk class of the device. For class A, notified body involvement is not required, so conformity with regulation requirements are self-declared by the manufacturer. For the other risk classes, a notified body is involved. The most common route is following Annex 9 of the regulation. This means completing a full quality management system assessment by the notified body through an audit and an assessment of the device technical documentation. This assessment can be done on a sampling based for class B and C, has to be done on individual devices, so all devices that are in the scope of the conformity assessment, if the device is class D, or B and C, but for self-testing, near patient testing, or if it's a companion diagnostics. In addition, if the device is a companion diagnostic, notified body are required to consult with the medicinal product authority and obtain an opinion on the scientific validity of the drug device combination. If the device is class D and it's a novel IVD, then the notified body is required to consult an expert panel, and regardless of whether the device is novel or not, batch verification is required. According to the regulation, this batch verification must be carried out by the European reference lab. Those reference laboratories have not been designated as of yet, so batch verification for the time being and until the labs are designated will be done by the notified body. We saw in the previous slides that the technical documentation was required also under the directive, but the requirements have been made stricter under the regulation. In the regulation, there are two annexes dedicated to the technical documentation, that is Annex 2 and Annex 3. Specifically, Annex 3 is dedicated to post-market surveillance. The manufacturer should include the post-market surveillance plan, so what they intend to do as part of their post-market surveillance strategy. And after the device has been on the market under the regulation, the periodic safety update report for Class C and D, and the post-market surveillance report for Class A and B. These are documenting the results of the post-market surveillance activities. In addition, as part of the technical documentation assessment, the notified body will review the summary of safety and performance. This is the detailed content of this are still being defined as at the time I'm recording this presentation. However, this can be seen as an expanded instruction for use for highest risk classes. And as for the instruction for use, this will need to be reviewed by the manufacturer. And once EUDAMED will be available, will need to be uploaded into EUDAMED and will be visible to the public. Also part of the technical documentation assessment is the review of the manufacturer declaration of conformity. We talked about the reasons why the directive was reviewed to become a regulation. Part of these reasons were to increase the overall transparency of the system for medical device and for IVDs. Also to facilitate the coordination and the communication between member states and facilitate the flow of information. So part of this, EUDAMED, or European Data Bank for Medical Devices, will be constituted of 6 modules. 3 are actually already available for use on a voluntary basis, and 3, vigilance, market surveillance, and performance studies, will become available at a later date. This database will have a restricted access. For example, member states will be able to see everything that's happening on their market to the devices available on their market, and the public access. And some of the information available to the public will be, for example, the summary of safety and performance we mentioned in the previous slides, the field safety notices, but also the information regarding the device present and the economic operators, that is manufacturer, authorized representative, and importer. 2 also enhance the traceability of the overall system. The regulation introduces a single registration number that identifies manufacturer, authorized rep, and importer. And for the traceability of the device, implements a unique device identification system. That is a sequence of numerical alphanumeric characters that are created by recognized identification and standards, and that will allow for an identification, an exact identification of the device on the market. There is a part that's specific to the device that's called the UDI DI, and the variable data that identifies, for example, the lot number of the device. I would like to also say a few words on the use of harmonized standard. This is included in the regulation under Article 8, and there is also an MDCG guidance clarifying the use of harmonized standard. What Article 8 says is that if a device is in conformity with a harmonized standard, it is presumed to be in conformity with the corresponding requirements of the regulation. The use of the standard is voluntary. It's quite widely used, but is still voluntary. As of today, the harmonization of ISO standards to the regulations is in progress. We have had a first set of 4 standards harmonized and published in the European journal, official journal. The second set is expected to happen in December, and it will include standards such as the 13485, so which are widely used across the medical device and the IVD industry. To conclude and to summarize what we discussed today, so the IVDR was published to create a strong and robust regulatory framework for in vitro diagnostic in Europe, but also to reduce the discrepancies in IVD legislation between member states and improving alignment with international guidelines. We saw the example with the classification. They said the date of application is approaching fast, and we are still expecting some guidance document, but also secondary legislation, for example, implementing acts for reference laboratory. So at this stage, it remains critical to follow the development of the legislation and the availability of this guidance document. And with that, thank you very much. And that concludes my presentation.